Let's discuss yarn weights and symbols. The information that you see here covers the information you'll need to determine which yarn type, yarn weight is going to be best for whichever project that you are crocheting. There are 7 different basic weight sizes, starting at lace here. That is a 0 in the count, right? Down to a 7, which is considered jumbo. So there are definitely more variations to this especially since they've started doing the really, really big yarns. So there's a lot of information past the 7, but the basic yarns that you're going to find in most big box stores are going to be 0 through 7. 0 is a thread yarn. It is a really thin yarn that resembles thread, right? And it is a 1 to 3 ply. And what the ply means is how many threads does it take to make this particular size. So in lace, you'll find it between 1 and 3 ply. So 1 to 3 different pieces of thread. As a beginner, what you need to focus on is this beauty right here. Number 4. It is a medium worsted weight yarn, occasionally called Aran or Afghan yarn. You will occasionally find some Aran yarns that are thicker than a worsted weight. Okay, that is definitely possible. But for a beginner, I always would recommend that you start right here with a medium 4 worsted weight yarn, which is 10 to 12 ply. That is 10 or 12 different pieces of thread that they have woven together to create this particular size. All right? Most of the lessons that I'm going to be teaching you are going to be using this very yarn right here, worsted weight yarn. It is the easiest, from my experience, to use to teach people how to start crocheting. It gives you enough thickness so that you can maneuver it easily on your hook and get familiar with it in your hand. But it is thin enough to give you the definition of a stitch that you really need to see as a beginner. Now let's talk yarn types. So there are a few basic types of fibers that you can find yarn made out of. You have animal fibers, right? There's several of those. You have plant fibers, and then you have what would be considered synthetic fibers, right? Now let's go ahead and look at all of these. Animal fiber yarn is generally sheep, alpaca, cashmere wool, llama wool, mohair, angora, or silk, right? If you want to see the specific breakdowns of how the yarn works, what it feels like, pros and cons, you can check out knittingknowledge.com. Now, the next one we have is, like I said, plant fibers. There's 4 different kinds of that: cotton, linen, bamboo, and hemp. Generally speaking, these are much more lightweight yarns. They do not give you a very dense project, depending on the weight of it, but they tend to let more air flow through. They tend to be flowier in their movement of fabric. And lastly, we have the synthetic fibers. The yarn that I use primarily to teach with and that I recommend you start with would be an acrylic yarn, okay? For 1, it's very easy to find. 2, it's very easy to wash. 3, it is far less expensive than the other plant fiber or animal fiber yarns. So as I said, there's 4. So we have acrylic, polyester, rayon, and nylon. Acrylic has a little bit more grip when you are working with your hooks. From my experience, they slip a little bit less depending on the brand. But the brand that I currently use and I will be teaching about is from Hobby Lobby, and it works wonders for me. Okay, so again, if you want more detailed information, the pros and cons, check out knittingknowledge.com. Her site is great. There are animal fibers, plant fibers, and synthetic fibers. And for our lessons, what I would like for you to use is acrylic, right? So this is the worsted weight yarn, right? It's a 4, it's a medium. This is the type of yarn that you would be using to learn how to crochet. I do not recommend using anything smaller than this, and I do not recommend using anything more than a step up from this when you are learning. I say that because the thickness of the yarn allows you better ease at seeing the stitches, as well as manipulating and maintaining the yarn in your hand and on your hook while you're learning. The larger yarns take a lot more effort and can be very cumbersome and challenging to do as a beginner. I'm not saying you can't, I'm saying it's challenging. If acrylic is not appealing to you and you would prefer a more natural fiber, cotton would be your second choice, right? So I recommend number 1 and then number 2. So acrylic first and then cotton. After that, if you genuinely don't want to work with any of those and you prefer a animal fiber, I would say sheep's wool. It can be very itchy. It can be kind of uncomfortable sometimes using it depending on the brand that you get, but it is a really good fiber. I just personally can't use it because it makes me itch. So, but out of those 3 choices, like I said, I recommend acrylic first, cotton second, and sheep wool third for beginners. Now you might find other people who say differently, and that's okay too. There is literally no wrong or right way to do this. It's kind of just some basic information that you take and make your own. Now let's slide back over here and look at yarn weight symbols, because we're going to need this information to determine how we pick out our yarn. So when you are shopping for yarn, you're going to have yarn labels. And the yarn labels are going to provide you with all of this different information that I will explain in a second. What I want to do though is show you this. So as I suggested, remember we're doing a worsted weight medium 4 yarn, okay, this here. If you look right here, maybe you can't see it, but in this little section right here, it shows you that your yarn on this label, or within this label, is a 4 medium. That means it is a medium worsted weight Aran or Afghan yarn, okay? This is a completely different brand of yarn. They also too have that very same symbol that represents the 4 worsted weight yarn, all right? If you would like to have a copy of this yarn weights and symbols chart, I would absolutely recommend going to moogly.com. This is where I got it from. She has some great tips, tricks, and information that you guys can use as well. Learning how to read a label will make it very easy for you to determine which yarn would be right for which project. So all yarn labels are going to have some iteration of the information in this black box. The way that they display it or arrange it on the yarn may vary, but the information will all be the same. All right. If you look in this upper left-hand corner and you see knitting needles, this information is irrelevant for you at this point. Unless you are deciding to start knitting, you do not need to know what size knitting needles pertain to this yarn. What you need to be concerned about is the box below that, the fabric care instructions, the yarn material, and the yardage. All right? So let's jump in with the hook. I'm going to pull it as close as I can. See that? It says I9 5.5, and it should give you 12 single crochets and 15 rows in a 4x4 inch gauge swatch. Okay, I know that was a mouthful. I know that you haven't covered gauges with me, and you may or may not have done the hooks, but I will explain. The I9 5.5 millimeters is the size of the hook, okay? And that information will often be found on the thumb bed of the hook, okay? So the measurement here, US I9 5.5 millimeter, is going to be somewhere on the crochet hook, and more often than not, that it's going to be in this thumb bed. Okay, this is not the same size that we should be using for the yarn that I'm talking about, but I wanted you to see where it would typically be. This information is the size of the hook that would work best for the thickness of this yarn. I'm gonna say that again. The label contains the information for the crochet hook that would work best with the weight of the yarn you are using. That does not mean that this is the only hook that you can use on this yarn. It just means that based on the recommendations, I9 will give you the best fabric from the yarn. It will allow you not to do it too tight and not too loose. Right. So briefly going over gauge, because that's a whole nother topic. 12 single crochets and 12 rows. So what they're saying is if you use a I9 and crochet 4 by 4 inch square, you should have 12 single crochets in the row going across and 15 rows of 12 single crochets. Okay? I have used hooks size F and G on this very same yarn and have had no issue. Again, it is merely a recommendation. And all it is indicating, like I said, is the number of stitches and rows that you can get out of a certain amount of space. Okay? And again, I'll go over gauge in another video. Next, let's move on to here. So as you can see, when we covered the chart, it had that yarn symbol, right? Medium 4 in a little skein of yarn on the label. All right, that is another indication that this is a worsted weight yarn. It is a number 4 yarn, all right? These are all of the care and washing instructions. I am not. All right, coming up here. This is what your yarn is made out of. It is 100% acrylic. Acrylic on. Here is net. So this is giving you how much yarn is contained in the skein that you're buying, right? You get 355 yards in this skein of yarn. So when you are looking for projects, so let's say example, you want to make a baby blanket. You need to know how much yarn it's going to take to make that blanket so that you know how much yarn you need to buy for that blanket, okay? You're going to need more than one skein of yarn. 355 is not enough. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you need 2, all right? Flipping this over, at this backside right here, you can see lot number, art number, color number, name, and the name of the yarn, color. This information will be somewhere on this on a label. Number is what the die lot number indicates the batch that this yarn skein came from. Okay. Now, when they do batches, they typically create a giant vat of whatever dye color they're using, and they will use that vat of dye color until it is completely gone. So what they do is they number all of the yarn that came out of that one vat of dye, because when they mix it again, the shade is not going to be exactly the same. It may be a little darker, it may be a little lighter. It'll still be that exact same purple color. But when you need to focus on the dye lot when you are picking out your yarn. So this is that number here, 911205, all right? You need to make sure that when you are getting multiples of the same color, that this number here matches, okay? The dye lot of your yarn needs to match the other dye lots or your colors will be off. It's even entirely possible that the thickness of the thread will be off. This is yarn from Walmart, and I would not recommend this for anything other than like toys or dog toys or something that's not going to be against a human's body for an extended period of time. That is my recommendation. That does not mean that you cannot still do it. That does not mean that anybody who uses it shouldn't be. It means I personally do not like this brand of yarn. All right. Now, so we're going to find the similarities and the differences so you are able to read the yarn labels fairly easily. So we've seen these gauge boxes. We discussed this and what they meant and what they indicated, right? They are recommending a hook or needle size that works best with their yarn. Roll over here and you see the same thing. We have the two boxes that indicate what is recommended for this yarn. Now, they have 12 stitches and 15 rows, just like Hobby Lobby does over here. They have the different sizes of the hooks, US I9, 5mm. It's the same thing on this side. Okay, now slide back over here. This is a worsted weight yarn. It is medium 4. Medium 4. It has 397 yards. And it's just kind of printed up here on the top, 7 ounces. 355 yards, but it's also 7 ounces. It has the contents of the fabric, 100% acrylic. It's the same thing there. It has your care instructions down here at the bottom. Have them right there as well. This actually has the written out care instructions on the label, and the Hobby Lobby one does not. It only has the symbols. So there's another difference. It gives you the exact care instructions for, and in Spanish, for your yarn. Now, let's flip this over. There it is. Okay, see? It's in a different spot. So here it is. It is 100% acrylic yarn in black, okay? Hobby Lobby's has white and their dye lot right above it. Okay, so the color name right here in the dye lot. This is the material, the color name, and this is the dye lot. This random number right here is the dye lot. All right. Now you see how it's kind of just randomly printed on? It looks like a stamp or something. It's not like part of the label as far as the ink and the printing go. That is because that is meant to indicate it's a different yarn. All of the outside and all the same stuff is going to be different, but the yarn specifically is going to be slightly different in color per batch number.